From Shamanism to Christianity and back again, an examination of spirituality and change among the Tlingit and Yupiit peoples by Mark Arvid White. The Yupiit, or Bering Sea Eskimos, are a group of native people located along the western coast of Alaska from Bristol Bay to Nome. Traditionally, the Yupiit belief system is one of a cosmological cycling between birth and rebirth, carefully maintained by strict attention to natural boundaries and observed ceremony. Yupiit believed that not only humans but animals had personhood, and that they, the Yupiit, were not dominant over animals or subordinate to them. This personhood or spirit, known as a Yua, inhabited all living things, and even inanimate objects, and would pass on to another body after death. Though they maintained the concept of a universal cosmic creator who sustained a framework of the order of things, the Yupiit worldview and cultural behavior of sharing, of communal interaction, of self-determination as a people was based upon the unwritten rules for proper living that guarded over the cosmological birthing cycle. For the Tlingit, there was a belief in a higher governing force in the universe, but who remained largely aloof. Closer and central to Tlingit beliefs was Raven, a trickster who nevertheless brought about much of the universe's shaping. Other animals and spiritual forces operated in day-to-day existence, and individual Tlingits would undertake cleansing by immersion in water to gain the assistance of guardian spirits for their daily life. Reincarnation was a reality to the Tlingit, and again, like the Yupiit, life was ordered around ritual observance, so that the Tlingit would properly play their part in the maintenance of all things. The chief determinant and operator in the keeping of Tlingit society in healthy harmony with the universe was a shaman, or Ixt, a ritualist healer, wise man, fortune teller, and spiritual warrior who used spiritual forces to assist him in his crucial tasks for the good of the people. The belief systems of the Tlingit and the Yupiit were forever altered upon the arrival of European and Euro-American societies in the 18th and 19th centuries. Alaska came under nominal control of the Russian Empire until the sale of the territory in 1867 to the United States and the gradual establishment of a more complete and permanent control over Alaska and its indigenous peoples. Both the Tlingit and the Yupiit interacted with the Russian advance into Alaska, as well as later American control, but with differing mindsets and ultimate results. The Tlingit first encountered Russian explorers in 1741, in what ultimately amounted to a violent incident. The pattern of violence between Russian explorers, then colonizers, would continue off and on throughout much of the 1800s. Though Russians controlled much of the Aleutians, they never really controlled any territory in Alaska's southeast, basically holding up in fortified outposts for a time until such fortifications were burned down by the Tlingit, only to be rebuilt again. In 1834 came the first Orthodox attempt to Christianize the Tlingit. This was largely unsuccessful until a smallpox epidemic hit the Tlingit, and the power of the shamans to combat the disease was shown to be ineffective. The Orthodox priests, however, had vaccines in their arsenal, and this display of healing power was enough to sway many Tlingit into becoming Orthodox believers, though it is unlikely that this belief in the new religion was very deep or very strong. More intrusive into the Tlingit belief system and way of life was the sale of Russian Alaska to the United States in 1867. Most Russians left the territory with the sale, and Tlingit adherence to orthodoxy largely went with them. The Tlingit were further impressed by advanced tools and other goods, as well as jobs that were brought into the region due to the new American rule, but the positives were soon heavily outweighed by the negatives. The control of the American political system weakened the kinship ties of Tlingit society, intruded into their internal affairs, and allowed for the influx of white settlements, which began to encroach on Tlingit's subsistence resources. Even more problematic to the Tlingit spiritual beliefs and culture was the arrival of Presbyterian missionaries into Alaska in 1878. The Presbyterians, backed by the U.S. civil and military authorities, began a great campaign against many of the practices and customs of the Tlingits, including shamanism, witchcraft trials, slavery, and polygamy. Most devastating to the traditional Tlingit way of life was likely the missionary and later public schools, which demanded obligatory attendance. The Tlingit elders approved the new knowledge afforded the youngsters, but it came at a terrible price. In the Presbyterian schools, the use of the native language was forbidden, and the children were indoctrinated in Protestant American values and taught that their parents' way of life was wrong. Tlingit response to the dual controlling factors of Protestantism and Americanism was to seek any ally available. They found one in the Russian Orthodox Church. The Orthodox had begun new efforts in the 1880s to reach out to the Tlingit, who saw them as a less offensive entity that at least allowed them their own language and a number of their customs, as well as being a legitimately recognized operative by the American government. As a result, the Tlingit began converting to Orthodoxy throughout the 1880s and 1890s, and by 1900, almost the entire Tlingit population of Sitka, as well as several surrounding communities, had converted. Contact between the Yupiit and Euro-Americans occurred at a much later date than for Alaska natives living along the Aleutians or southern coastal areas of Alaska. Russians were not pressing into Yupiit territory until the 19th century, and a lack of obviously abundant resources kept the new American overlords largely at bay before the 20th century. Russian missionaries came to live among the Yupiit in the late 1800s, introducing them to Orthodox Christianity. This was later followed by various Protestant missionaries well into the 1900s. As with Christianization efforts in the southeast of Alaska, the Orthodox were more lenient than the Protestants, letting the Yupiit retain their language and greater portions of their pre-contact beliefs. For some Yupiit, such as those on Nunivak Island who converted to Protestantism at the efforts of missionaries of the Swedish Evangelical Mission Covenant Church, the adherence to the adopted faith seems complete, though not necessarily total, as the Nunivakers still retain their mask-making traditions, albeit with altered masks to reflect their devotion to their newfound faith. The historical tapestry of the Yupiit and Tlingit encounters with Christianity has oftentimes been unfurled in a manner depicting a monolithic Euro-American West, either bringing enlightenment to ignorant indigenous peoples or trampling upon their rights of self-determination. The indigenous spiritual point of view has been characterized thusly: that spirituality permeates the universe, that humans have responsibility for maintaining harmony with the world, that time is circular, that elders are respected, that nature is honored, and that there is a sense of empathy and kinship with all forms of life. Monolithic Western belief has been portrayed in this regard, that spirituality is centered in a supreme being, that humans have dominion over all things, that time is linear, that respect is given for material achievement, and that humans are separate from and superior to all other forms of life. While some elements of this side-by-side analysis are certainly true in the context of evaluation for disaster planning or a general review, it proves misleading for examination of the spiritual beliefs of the Yupiit and the Tlingit from a pre-contact tradition to a post-contact reality. The West, even that portion that made and continues to make its impact upon the Tlingit, Yupiit, and other indigenous peoples of Alaska, is not monolithic. The Russian and the American interests in Alaska and the forces that sought them were never one and the same. Russians came with imperialistic policy territory seekers, Orthodox monks primarily interested in expanding God's kingdom, and trappers whose goal was to make a profit. Usually these disparate groups would find a way to hold up a unified front, but not always. The Americans were even more divided, with fierce evangelists, greedy miners, the military, white settlers, and the government all seeking to pacify the natives, but all for different reasons. Certainly the government would side with the missionaries, or the military might back them up, but they were never a monolithic West. And in turning to considerations of the spiritual beliefs of the Tlingit and the Yupiit today, it becomes clear that the complexity of the West versus the indigenous peoples and their beliefs make the general use of the term untenable. The notion that, for the Western worldview, spirituality is centered in a single supreme being holds sway with many Euro-Americans, but not all, and certainly not for every institution examined. For the oil companies, the resource industries, and every profit-seeking institution, the Protestant work ethic and dominion certainly hold sway, though the notion of a single supreme being is probably irrelevant. For the state and local governments, the spirituality aspect is also of less importance than compliance with the laws. For the scientific community, neither a spirituality of the cosmos nor a single supreme being is of any functional relevance for today. Oddly enough, it is with the Christian churches that the idea of spiritual consideration and belief makes the most impact, sometimes to oppose the specific indigenous variation thereof, and sometimes, more rarely, to acknowledge a kinship with others who have a spiritual as opposed to a completely secular mindset. The question of reclamation of traditional spiritual values for the Tlingit and the Yupiit is, on the one hand, largely a moot point, as most of the Tlingit and Yupiit today make claims to being Christian. On the other hand, reclamation is probably a misnomer as well, seeing that both native groups, or more specifically portions thereof, never completely let go of their beliefs to start with. In response to the notion of complete conversion to Christianity in at least some Yupiit areas, many descendants maintain that the coming of Christianity merely gave new form to old beliefs, and that the animism of tradition is still alive and well, albeit expressed in different ways. Many Tlingit are attempting to come to grips with the question of their own reality as an indigenous people whose traditional religious views have been altered forever by the coming of Christianity, and indeed other elements of Western ideology. Some of them, while affirming their present Christian faith and using Christian concepts to reinterpret their own past, nevertheless reject previous missionary views of their pre-contact beliefs being primitive and pagan. The Tlingit adapted to the onrush of new society and new beliefs in admirable style, accepting change but also justifying their pre-contact ceremonies and practices, highlighting the social functions thereof, while necessarily downplaying the religious factor. The pressures brought to bear on native groups by non-native Christian clergy to acculturate has eased in the past few decades, and there is more tolerance for indigenous customs that do not directly contradict Christian teachings. Among a sampling of modern Tlingit Christian leaders, it was found that very few rejected the traditional shamanistic beliefs, and some even asserted that there were no contradictions between the traditional beliefs and Christianity. Spiritual identity among the Tlingit and Yupiit is determined not only by outside forces and the scope of historical change, but by the life choices of these two peoples and their individual members. In the midst of a re-recognition of traditional spiritual views, especially regarding the application of art, dance, and subsistence needs, there are a number of Alaska Natives who have fully embraced that version of the Christian faith in which they currently reside, to the point of altering traditional practices so as not to conflict with their currently held beliefs. The Yupiit of Nunivak Island, for instance, created artistic variations on their traditional shaman masks in order to show their commitment to their adopted evangelical Christian beliefs. New mask-like items which no longer had eye holes, and therefore no traditional spiritual power. Among the Tlingit, the insurgence of a strand of evangelical Pentecostalism produced the controversial situation of a Tlingit itinerant preacher convincing her flock to burn non-Christian items in a bonfire to demonstrate their new faith, a bonfire possibly fueled by the inclusion of traditional Tlingit dancing gear. Even the famed Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, ANSCA, ostensibly providing Alaska Natives with a measure of restored autonomy and reconnection with historical use of the land and its resources, also helps to redefine their culture in narrow terms, mainly that of the law as espoused by ANSCA and the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. Such defining of what it means to be native along strict legal lines means that Alaska Natives who choose their own path, whether religious or political, face the possibility of losing claim to being native altogether, because they have not chosen to participate in the American economy as people who maintain an extraordinary and distinct cultural difference that defines them as native. The Yupiit and Tlingit peoples formed their own religious beliefs over a number of centuries, only to see those beliefs confronted and supplanted by the societal structures and, by their own admission, dominant spiritual power of a new faith. The old beliefs, despite the formidable array of challenges against them, still remains, and sometimes only as an assertive memory, but at other times as an unbroken link to a spiritual tradition as alive as the wind and the sea. Ultimately, the Tlingit and the Yupiit will decide their own spiritual fates, as is their right as vibrant, creative, proud peoples of the North, and whatever their choices might be, it is likely that the voices of shaman and raven will never be completely removed.